Me and 5 of my friends and colleagues are working on our final capstone project as part of the Sheridan Game Design Program. Development of this project is going to take place over 8 months and is split into 5 phases. Now, we're entering the pre-production phase, with our first milestone to create a proof of concept. The purpose of a proof of concept is to determine if our core idea can be turned into a full game. In this devlog, we're going to show you how we developed our proof of concept by bringing all of our ideas together into one cohesive build. I was in charge of level design. I started by whipping up a quick level design document. This is probably no surprise to anyone, but ocean lore goes kinda crazy, so I had lots of interesting material to work with. For this level, I decided on making the goal revolve around a diving bell, which are literal giant bell-shaped chambers people would get inside of and use to go deep underwater. For the story, I thought it'd be sick if the bell got stuck because of the storm, and you have to ring it, so the bell will crash through the ground and you can reach the next level. Not really how a diving bell works, but I was running out of time and needed to move on to designing the layout. My goal was to design something that covers all 3 of our gameplay styles, which are platforming, puzzles, and combat. In the future, we want our levels to be more of an open sandbox that gives players room to experiment with our mechanics and explore at their own pace. But that was out of scope for the POC. So I decided it would be best to make a more linear level, with branching paths, one side focusing on puzzles and the other side focusing on combat, with small platforming sections featured in both. This way, we could get player feedback on all of these gameplay styles, to see what's working and what needs improvement. After I had a rough plan ready, I made a metrics playground to get an idea for the player's capabilities, which means knowing how high the player can jump or the max distance they can reach objects. Once that was complete, I was finally ready to move on to grayboxing. Your goal is to ring the giant bell by completing the puzzle path, where you must manipulate blocks to platform your way to the top, and the combat path, which has lots of evil enemies patrolling, and I also sprinkled around some NPCs that you save by popping them off spikes. Once you reach the top of each path, you can finally ring the bell, which feels super epic.
Ignore the goofy animation, I ran out of time.
It's proof of concept week. This deadline honestly snuck up on us so fast, and we were pretty ambitious with the content we wanted to include since this was a major milestone, but I think we did a pretty good job overall. I started by updating the visuals of the lasso so that instead of a static straight line that lags behind, now it bends, just to give a bit more visual heft to moving things around. I also added a new mode to the object yank. Previously, objects bigger and heavier than the player pull the player towards the object, and lighter and smaller objects get pulled directly to the player's hand. But an issue arose where players couldn't really tell if something was big enough to be an anchor or small enough to hold, and so, to help my level designer as well, I added a middle ground where medium-sized objects receive a moderate tug towards the player, just to make things easier to understand overall. Next, the physics on the lasso got a big upgrade. Before, objects would kind of just float when they were held. They only reacted somewhat realistically from that hold point when you move them around. But there was some pretty heavy dampening and other things going on under the hood to keep forces under control. Now, take a look. Notice how the held object hangs naturally instead of just dangling aimlessly midair? It's now physically accurate, as if you're really holding on from the point that you grabbed. This took way too long working on torque and force calculations to keep the physics from going absolutely insane, but it was worth it, because the lasso now feels distinct from all other physics hold mechanics in other games. I also added aim assist, but sadly it didn't make it to the POC build. There's an auto snap mode that chooses the object closest to the middle of your screen, and a sort of buffer mode that makes it easier to aim by artificially increasing the hitbox size. As well, there's now the lasso snapback mechanic. Players feel a stretch resistance when an object is stuck behind something, restricting their movement as they pull further and further away as they're trying to pull on something that's caught. When they stop moving, they receive a snapback effect, like an elastic band. I figured this would be better than simply severing the connection, and it sort of aligns with that natural, instinctive, and easy to understand design philosophy that I'm building the lasso around. And finally, some UX things. Outlines on mouse over and hold, field of view change on swinging and holding things, and a vignette effect to indicate that snapback tension. Just to add a tiny bit of polish. These last 2 weeks flew by, and it somehow all came together at the end. I'm really proud of my teammates for pulling it off.
For the past few weeks, I worked on multiple stuff. I made an island generator using Houdini. It's still very early with little control and quite unstable at times, but it's good enough for now until we need final assets. The generator takes in a shape input. In my case, I use a cube. That cube is divided into halves, the top and the bottom. The top part is kept intact, while the bottom part is shattered and the pieces on the other parts are removed. They are then combined again, then remeshed to create a high poly island. Some noise is applied at the end, then the low poly version is created. After that, textures are baked and the low poly with the normals are brought into the game. I then created the ground textures for the island, and with the help of triplanar mapping, the islands are done. After that, I updated the tethers to use configurable joints instead of applying forces manually, which is how the old system worked. The joints are much more stable, two tethered objects don't randomly fly anymore, and there are a lot of useful parameters I can set using the configurable joints. The next thing I worked on was implementing features from an older version of the project. Other than the tether, the lasso was also changed on how it worked, so most of the old items we made were not compatible anymore. It was my responsibility to update all of the items we want to reuse and bring them in. I then helped with our game's boss battle, adding a laser attack for a boss. During this attack, players have to pull down the boss's broken off shells as a shield.
My first task during this week was to make a quick and simple enemy to add to the level. Previously, I'd already made one for my combat prototype, but our game was going in a different direction before, focusing now more on puzzles and exploration rather than action. To account for this, I reworked the enemies to be simpler and simply run at the player instead of shooting projectiles at them. Since we don't have a health system, I thought that would be appropriate to have the enemy launch the player in a direction if it lands an attack. Hopefully it would startle the player, but still give them a chance to recover. I wanted to compensate for the easier combat by creating a focused boss encounter that would provide a more engaging threat for the player. We were a bit tight on time, so I wanted to make it simple and straightforward while still being an effective demonstration of some more exciting combat beats we could have gone forwards with. I drew inspiration from games like Super Mario Odyssey and Twilight Princess, where you have to wait for the boss to mess up in some way so that you can damage them. In this case, I made the boss shoot projectiles so that you could use your tether to send them back and damage it. The boss was looking pretty cool, but it could be even cooler, so I asked Deegan if he could take some time to add in a second laser attack. We talked about how it would work and settled on giant laser the player would have to hide from. As the boss took damage, walls would spawn so that when the laser comes in, the player can place one down and hide behind it. This gave the boss an element of spectacle that it definitely needed, and really showcased some of the interesting ways players could improvise their success during gameplay. Lastly, I quickly added some thunder ambience that paired nicely with the rain sounds we already had, and then got to work on the music. I had an old track I had used for a previous project, so I pulled that up and switched the instruments and effects on it to give it more of a muted and oceanic vibe. I also borrowed a song from our school's music library to use for the boss battle, something with a bit of swing to make the fight feel a bit more energetic and different from the rest of the level. A bit of programming later, and the music would fade between the two when the player entered and finished the boss fight. I think it sounds pretty good. The part I ended up being the busiest with was the audio. I needed to fill in the areas we hadn't added sound to, and there was a lot. When programming features and mechanics, the priority normally lays with making it work rather than figuring out where to put the sound, so I had to take a lot of time searching through the code and talking to group members to find where I could play the sound effects we needed. The other time-consuming part was discovering new quiet zones, little actions or movements that had no associated sound that realistically should have had something. Every time I found one of these, it meant making a new sound effect and more work on implementation. The tricky part too is you only really find these through playtesting, so it was hard to predict how many more of them there were. Still, by the end of it, we had all the sound we needed to provide effective feedback for all the events that would happen in the game.
These past couple of weeks, I supported the development of a proof of concept build in a couple of ways. One task that I took on was creating assets for NPC characters, as well as a couple of other objects. I've never been strong in 3D art, so this definitely felt like a huge undertaking for me. Luckily, one of our teammates found a piece of software called Asset Forge, which made it really easy and intuitive to make simple placeholder models. I definitely don't think that this software is going to get us through the whole project, but as far as prototyping goes, I found it really useful. While developing these characters, Anona and I worked closely together to solidify the visual themes. Inspired by some of our narrative pitches from a few weeks earlier, we went with an oceanic theme. These little guys are inspired by sea snails. We really fell in love with their unique shapes, colors, and features across the species, and thought they would be perfect for a more fantastical setting. I also added some dialogue sprites and created a quick script that shows the dialogue when you are near the NPC, turns it off when you get too far away, and billboards towards the player so that they can always see the 2D sprite. My other big contribution was the main menu. In my previous projects, I found it really useful to get the functional scenes such as the main menu out of the way as early as possible. This helps add clarity to new players and also speeds up the process of restarting the game. Once I got the functionality all good to go, Winona created some art assets to get rid of that ugly placeholder look. I'm really proud of our team for incorporating so many features into our proof of concept. We have a lot that we can now receive feedback on and a strong foundation to design the rest of our game.
Hey, Onona from the art team again. This time I worked on a bit of behind-the-scenes documentation, while also focusing on making a bunch of quick placeholder assets. Most for the actual 3D environment, but a few for the title screen too. We've got quite a few documents to keep updated as we go along that'll help with planning, but those aren't as exciting, so I'll fill you in on what's more exciting. Decorating the world. Even though this was just a proof of concept, I wanted to use it as an opportunity to test out the theme we plan to use for our game world, and see how players would react to it. I made a bunch of placeholder 3D environment models using Asset Forge. These were made quick and a little ugly, using funny things like doors colored pink, and the roof of a little market stall to make shelves for the world. I also got Deegan to make some textures for the islands, based on my mood boards, to make the world feel even more aquatic. I then imported them into Unity, so I could start arting the level. The main goal was to use these simple models to match the environment I was planning out last time using my mood boards. I wasn't placing things all willy-nilly though. While arting the level, you've got to keep in mind things like where the level is trying to lead players to, or points that the player could use as landmarks to know where they are. You've also got to remember that the placement of your props can tell a story. That's called environmental storytelling. Since Brayden did most of the level design, I communicated with him to know what needed emphasis, and tried to use the decorations to elevate what was already there, rather than just make things look pretty. Since we didn't have a specific story in mind with this level, I just tried to suggest that it was a fantasy world thrown into disarray by the storm, and that the little guys all over the place would have lived peacefully in those little houses if it wasn't for all the destruction. This week was super busy, and we were definitely ambitious with it, but we made it just in time. The team's been super aligned so far, and I really hope we can make our next build better than this one.